Hello, everybody. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on CSAs and financial aid, understanding the impact of assets. And we really appreciate everybody joining us today. We wish everybody that, that you're safe, that you're healthy and they're giving this time. And we know that there's some hurdles being, virtual, but we really appreciate everybody joining us today. So I'm Oliver Robinson, a program associate at Children's Savings at Prosperity Now, and I will be your host today. So just to run through a couple housekeeping items, this webinar will be recorded and made available to registrants. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. If you want to ask a question or share your thoughts, you can do that by typing into the text box of the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. So some info on the Q&A technology. To share comments or ask questions at any time, you can type the question into the text box in your control panel. And again, if you're experiencing any technical issues, email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. So our speakers for today are Aaron Thiemann, a program manager at Children's Savings Team Prosperity Now, as well as MorraLee Keller, who's the director of technical assistant at the National College Attainment Network, also known as NCAN. So just for some context, we've had a lot of questions, from folks throughout the field about, college access and CSAs, kind of how they're connected, the relevance, and a lot of general questions that folks want answered. So we're really pleased to have a representative from NCAN today to kind of help us just paint a bit broader picture about, the relationship between CSAs and college access and really get folks' questions answered today. So with that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Aaron.
Thanks, Oliver, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as Oliver said, our objectives today are to hear from our partner at NCAN. I'll introduce MorraLee Keller in a minute, and help us understand how the financial aid process treats savings for college, including CSAs. A lot of our folks in the field begin working with much younger students and have had less experience in the financial aid process. So we're going to learn a bit today. Second, we're going to identify some pros and cons of CSA distribution options. And that just means what happens to the money in a CSA account as it's distributed when a student goes on to college. And finally, we're going to explore some opportunities to work toward universal treatment of CSAs in financial aid determinations. And if that sounds very wonky and in the weeds, we will get to it in a bit and talk about how the financial aid field has evolved. So on the next slide, we are going to just go through and learn a little bit about who is in the room today. So I'm going to launch one of our 2 poll questions. So the first question is, what type of entity do you represent? Options are nonprofit organization, local or state government agency, community foundation, educational institution, or other. All right, we'll give folks a few more seconds, but it looks like most of you have voted. All right, so it looks like about half of you are representing a nonprofit organization, about 24% are local or state government agency. I see lots of municipal folks on the attendees list, and about 10% with an educational institution, and then split between community foundation and other. So we've got lots of different folks in the room today. So welcome, we're glad you're here. And if we can go now to the next poll. Awesome, thanks Chupa. So the next poll question is just learning a little bit about if you run a CSA program. So if you do run a CSA program, what type of account does your program use for program funds? And to be clear here, we're talking about the types of accounts that your program holds, not necessarily the one that parents use to save in. So we'll give folks a minute to answer this question, and that'll help us tailor our responses and get your questions answered. All right, we'll close the poll in just a few seconds. All right, so we're going to see our results here in a second, but it looks like we've got a majority of folks using a 529 plan, followed by a custodial account at a bank or credit union. This is pretty reflective of the field in general in terms of participants using a CSA program and what types of accounts they use. So we've got another great mix of folks here too. I'm curious about this group in CDs and other investment products, but we'll move on. So now that we know a little bit more about who is in the room, I'm going to introduce MorraLee Keller. MorraLee is Director of Technical Assistance at the National College Attainment Network, or NCAN, and I'm so happy to have MorraLee here to help us really understand the financial aid process. And this webinar really came out of lots of programs reaching out to us or reaching out to other CSA experts, and with this question of how do CSAs impact a student when they're going off to college? How do their savings work in the financial aid process? How does the FAFSA work? Really just a lot of questions about what's next. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to MorraLee, and she's going to walk us through the financial aid process and share some information with us. So MorraLee.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks to Erin and to Prosperity Now for the invitation to be able to talk with all of you today. Hopefully we will be able to answer some questions. As this area goes in financial aid, we may end up with more questions at the end than you had before you got here, but hopefully we'll be able to resolve some of those. So next slide, please. Let me just tell you a little bit about the National College Attainment Network for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. We're a national membership organization with a mission to build, strengthen, and empower communities and stakeholders to close equity gaps in post-secondary attainment for all students. We are 25 years old this year. This is our 25th anniversary. We have, I think it's really close to 500 organizations, community-based access programs, school districts, colleges, foundations, state agencies, supporting organizations that are all members in INCAN. We're a small but mighty staff of 13, most of whom are located in the DC area. I happen to be in Ohio, and we have one colleague who is located in California. As you can imagine, the majority of our members are doing work targeted at low-income, first-generation minority students in putting them on a path to and through some type of post-secondary credential or degree program. Next slide, please. We have several areas that we work on at NCAN. These tend to be our high priority areas. Member services and capacity building, we are consistently and constantly providing professional development to our members, sharing best practices, sharing research that's out there in the field, all so that they can better serve the students that they are trying to prepare to enter and succeed in college. We do a lot of work, obviously being located in Washington, D.C., in the policy and advocacy world. We are very fortunate to have a lot of great DC colleagues, and they call upon us, we call upon them as we see different types of policy ideas that come forth to figure out if those type of things are good for our students. Should we support them? Are there modifications to the policies? And we do a lot of advocacy work to make sure that folks in DC understand what will best serve our students. We do a lot of collaboration with key stakeholders. We work with the other national organizations like NASFA, the National Financial Aid Administrators Association, and NACAC, and key other education national organizations, so that we're all on the same page. Our colleagues at Gear Up and at TRIO and all those different kind of programs. So we try to work together as many ways and that we can. And sort of the underlying message in everything we do is around data and using data to drive decisions. We want our individual member programs to do that. We want to do that. We continue to advocate and introduce data sources to our members. The National Student Clearinghouse, which kind of paints the clearest picture about where students enroll and how they do once they get there. We're a strong advocate for our members and school districts, et cetera, using NSC data. So we like numbers, and we want other folks to like them as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the areas of expertise, you know, as I mentioned, sharing a lot of best practices in college access and success. We are always up to date on education policy. We constantly try to serve as the voice for the students that our members are serving. We provide a lot of professional development, training, webinars, e-learning options. Our members and staff members are pretty solid experts in the admissions and the financial aid application process. We promote research in the field whenever we see things that we think can be utilized by our members that will help inform their practices. and their strategies when serving students. And obviously we do a lot of data tracking and analyzing. We have a director of data and evaluation on our staff. So these are the areas that we try to make sure that we are as strong as possible as a staff in the college access and attainment field. Next slide, please. So prior to coming to the college access world, I worked in a financial aid office for several years. And the favorite answer when you want to talk about something that's related to the financial aid process, the favorite answer is it depends. And that's a little bit about how we're going to be answering some of the questions today around the savings accounts. So I hope that you understand that it depends will be weighted on a lot of different factors depending on how the savings accounts play out individually for the students. But don't be surprised when if you ask anybody certain questions, or you ask someone at an institution, and if you hear the answer, it depends, and it depends on this or it depends on that. So next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the financial aid process and how assets and things get rolled into this picture. So as you may be aware, the majority of students in the country who want to apply for financial aid, whether that's from the federal government, the state, or their colleges, they all will complete the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. And that is the document that the institutions will utilize to determine a student's federal, and in many cases state aid eligibility, as well as eligibility for financial assistance directly from the institution. For those of you, if you've filed a FAFSA, I'm sure you understand the type of questions on there. But if you've not ever filed one or taken a look at one, assuming that the student is a dependent student on their parents, students and parents are going to be required to report income and assets currently available to them when they are filing the form. For example, the class of 2021, their FAFSA for the next academic year, next fall, opened October 1. So we are in the midst of lots of students completing the FAFSA that would like to enroll in college next year. On the FAFSA that they are completing now, they are reporting their 2019 income. So the income, as we often refer to it, as prior year, and that's prior to the year they intend to enroll. So students that will be seniors next year will be reporting their 2020 income, and so that will move forward each year with the FAFSA. When completing the FAFSA, families that have incomes under $50,000, depending on a few other circumstances, are often not required to even report assets on the form. You know, the majority of folks, over 99% of the people who complete the FAFSA, complete it online. And the online version is built with skip logic, so that once certain questions are filled in, future questions for some folks that do not apply, they'll never even see them on the screen. So please know that there are a lot of families that are never even required to report assets. But if they are, we want you to understand all the different kinds of things that are considered assets. So it is things like cash they have on hand, checking and savings accounts, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, net value of real estate, not the home they live in, this would be other real estate that they own, money market funds, educational benefits, educational savings accounts, so 529 plans, money market funds, and net business value, but only if the business has 100 or more employees. We also want you to understand what assets do not include. And you already heard that I mentioned that the home value is not considered in assets. Neither are retirement accounts, pension and annuities, and non-education IRAs. Those are items that if the family has those, they are not required to be reported on the FAFSA. So once a student and parents have completed the FAFSA and put all the information on it and submitted it, they will get a document back called a student aid report. And the most critical piece of information on that student aid report is the expected family contribution, or EFC number. That EFC number is determined by a formula that is actually legislated into law about how to treat all the information that was placed on the form. And that EFC is what most of the college financial aid offices will use to determine if the student qualifies for need-based aid. So let's do a quick example. If the student is going to attend, let's say, an institution that with tuition, room and board, books and supplies, etc., costs about $45,000 for the year. If the expected family contribution is $7,000, that is a family that has a very high need of $38,000 to cover all the expenses associated with attending that particular institution. So in a sense, that's how the EFC is used. The college will look at their annual cost, subtract the EFC, and then put together a financial aid package that will attempt to address the gap not covered by the EFC. Next slide, please. So if there are CSAs involved for the student filing a FAFSA, how will it be treated? And as I indicated before, it depends will be a common answer. Sometimes it will depend on who whose names the funds are in on the day that the FAFSA is filed. It could be that when the student files the FAFSA on the day they do it, do they even remember that there is an account that they have some money in that may have been there for years, and they didn't even think about it, and so therefore didn't report it on the form. It will also depend on, when and how the funds are dispersed by the organization that manages the CSA. You have to think about what options will be used in terms of requesting the funds, or how the funds will be dispersed to the students. I will tell you that, we saw a large response that many of you have your dollars in the form of 529 plans. So there are very explicit instructions on the form about how dollars in 529 plans are reported on the FAFSA. But, when 529s began to be popular several years ago, how those were treated, the answer was definitely it depends. It took a few years through the FAFSA cycles for there to become very clear guidance out of the education department about how 529 plans were to be treated. And so I suspect, depending on what shape and form some of the CSAs take, we may see it take a year or two through the FAFSA cycle till there's very clear instructions on the FAFSA about how a family would report any CSA funds. Next slide, please. The potential treatment of the funds, when you're reporting it on the FAFSA, it sort of depends on whose name the account is in. Oftentimes when setting something up for a young child, particularly if it's at a bank or a credit union, the fund may have two names on it. It may have the student's name on it, but it also may have, because they're under 18, it may have an adult name on it. If the fund is sitting intact like that on the day that the FAFSA is filed, that savings amount may be reported under the parent section of the form. If you choose as an organization to directly distribute the funding to the student, for example, in the form of gift cards or something like that, it may not end up being reported on the FAFSA. If anyone considers direct distribution directly to the colleges, and this is what happened to the 529s at the very beginning, when the dollars arrived from the outside agency, they were treated like an outside scholarship and were counted as such at the institution. The good news is that in some respects, most colleges in the country are not able to meet the student's need. When we talk about a gap for the cost of the college minus the expected family contribution and then minus any financial aid available, there typically is a gap. So if there are any outside dollars that come in from any type of organization, they usually do not have a major effect on the student's financial aid. And depending on when and how they're distributed, there could be no impact at all on the student's financial aid package. Next slide, please. So things to think about, for those of you that have it in 529s, the 529 plans will control and have all the rules and regulations. But if there are any other things that are going to be considered as disbursement methods, if you're going to make checks, payable to the student, you want to think about depending on how much is in the account, do we want to do it one time and then, in a sense, close out the account? We heard suggestions earlier in some of the earlier conversations that I had with some of your folks about using prepaid gift cards to students as a method. Probably the most detailed level that you could go to is making checks payable to the institutions that the student will attend, but that requires a lot more management on your part to understand where everybody is going and getting the dollars out to the colleges. The one thing, good news about sending the money directly to the college is you absolutely know all those dollars will be placed towards educational expenses. Much of the money oftentimes in the accounts will be from the family, should the managing organization be down involved in the details for distribution is probably a question to be discussed. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's kind of a snapshot of the information. So Aaron, I'm assuming you're going to come back in and we'll talk a little bit and we'll see if people have placed any questions in the chat box or anything like that.
Yep, absolutely. So on the next slide too, but I think it's just a discussion screen. So before we move into the audience Q&A, I have a couple of questions for you, MorraLee, based on some programs that we spoke with, and then just one clarifying question. But before I ask that, I just want to give a reminder to all of our attendees that you can drop any of your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that we address those. We have plenty of time for Q&A, so don't be afraid to ask your questions. I know I'm learning a lot just sitting here as a former CSA program manager, so definitely feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. I'm wondering if you could just clarify for the audience, many of whom, like myself, are less experienced with the financial aid process. Could you just clarify how savings in a 529 get treated in the FAFSA process? I know there's a formula that I believe it's 5.6% of the asset gets counted, but could you just clarify and make sure that I've said that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, when most 529 plans are set up, oftentimes there are two names on the account, the adult and the student name. Assuming that the account is sitting in that situation and the student is, still living with parents and dependent upon the parents, most 529 values are reported in the parent assets section of the form, and the parent assets are treated much kinder in the formula, like you indicated, Aaron. A much smaller percentage of assets are taken into consideration for parents in the financial aid formula. If for some reason the student has reached age 18 or is over 18 and the 529 plan is in their name only, then the 529 would be reported in the student asset section of the form. But I would think you would by far see the majority of 529 plans reported in the parent asset section of the form.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So that kind of brings me to my first question. So how might families be impacted differently by saving on their own versus participating in a CSA program? So as you just said, if families open their own 529 account and they're making deposits, that will be accounted for in their when they're filling out the FAFSA. And if they have savings, let's say a family has $500 in a CSA account that's owned by a program, So those get treated differently, correct? But the family savings will be in their own, they go in their own process in the FAFSA, correct?
Yes, sort of. I'm going to go to the it depends. My favorite answer, right? Aaron, that yes, any family that has a typical savings account opened at a banking institution or a credit union, and they have dollars in there, and if the account's in the parent's name, that's going to get reported in the parent asset section. When it comes to the child savings accounts, if there are individual names on the account, those also may be reported as assets. This is where we're going to have to, get some clarification out of the education department, sooner than later about the direct way to treat those savings accounts, because if they're, it's just a gray area when it's held by an organization, but if there is a student and or parent name on the account, and they have access to those dollars, that's technically an asset in the financial aid world.
Thank you. And could you speak a little bit to something that you mentioned earlier about this expected family contribution for families with less than $50,000 in income? And could you just talk a little bit about kind of how the financial aid process works for families that have very low income, and kind of how we maximize the financial aid package for families with very low incomes? What I'm hearing is that for families with very low income, their savings won't be accounted for at all. And so it's potentially a great opportunity for families to build up their savings and not fear that they're going to be penalized down the road. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. That federal formula that determines the expected family contributions has a couple what I might call layers of complexity in the formula. The simplest complex or the least complex formula comes for families who have adjusted gross incomes under $25,000 and may also get, some of the federal means tested benefits, free and reduced lunch or SNAP, I'm sorry, TANF, and things like that. And those folks, when they file the form, all the asset questions will disappear. And if they are in that income bracket, their expected family contribution will be automatically a zero. So they have the simplest path through the FAFSA. For families with incomes between $25,000 and $50,000, depending on a few of other questions on the FAFSA, they may qualify for what we refer to as a simplified needs test. And if they qualify for the simplified needs formula, they will not be asked the asset question either. So in general, you can say most families under $50,000 will not ever see the asset question. So families in that situation will not be asked asset questions on the FAFSA, and therefore won't have to report assets in any of the categories that I previously mentioned. Once the income is in excess of $50,000, the asset questions will appear, and the families will be required to answer those questions.
Okay, and that $50,000 is set at the federal level. It doesn't vary institution by institution.
No, that's not. No, that's a federal. That's a federal formula.
Great. And I have just one more question before we move into Q&A. So on the potential distribution of funds slide, you talked about a few different options for CSA programs that are thinking about how to get this money out the door for accounts that they own. What would you recommend to programs that are trying to figure out how to structure their program to, one, minimize the financial aid impact on students, and two, kind of make this process something that programs can handle administratively? I know that came up a lot in your conversations with programs, particularly with San Francisco, trying to weigh out some options of how to make it easy to use and how to minimize the impact on financial aid.
Yeah, I think probably the easiest would be for, particularly, it's my understanding that a lot of times the accounts will have smaller amounts of money in them. These are not going to be accounts with $10 and $15 and $20,000 in them in the majority of cases. So if they're accounts with, a few $100s or maybe, under $2,000, then certainly setting up a process where there can be a direct distribution to the student in a timely manner. And you want to think about that with most fall semesters starting in August in a normal year, and fee payment probably due earlier that month is thinking about a July disbursement of dollars in the form of a check. And certainly when it's the smaller amount, I would assume you'd want to do it in one single distribution to minimize, the capacity that the organization will need to get those dollars dispersed. And sometimes it may even be the organization working with the financial institution where the accounts have been established, and that actually that financial institution would distribute the dollars to the student in the accounts. I did hear one option of the gift cards. And so again, perhaps there could be, the financial institution could go through the accounts and purchase gift cards on an annual basis in the amount that the family has or the student has in that account and disperse it directly to the student. I think for these small amounts and for families with the low incomes, like I said, there's probably little to no effect at all on the student's financial aid package. So that would be encouraging. If there are families with incomes in excess of $50,000 and they're going to be reporting assets, again, there could be some small impact, in terms of the size of the expected family contribution once all the answers in the FAFSA are run through the formula, but probably fairly minimal if the student has, small dollar amounts in those savings accounts.
Great, thanks. So what I'm hearing in that question, MorraLee, is one, just to clarify, the prepaid gift cards as an option that you were talking about was a question from a program that uses a bank account, not a 529. So we should just clarify that different program account structures have kind of different options on disbursement. And two, what I'm hearing from you is that understanding kind of the demographics of your families is going to be really key as you help families navigate this process. Because if you are in a program that serve mostly low-income families, which most of our CSA programs do, or at least have a particular focus on low-income families, that it's more likely that it will have minimum impact or minimal impact on their FAFSA just based on their income and potential other assets. So that's really helpful to know. So we've gotten a lot of questions in the Q&A box. Definitely keep them coming. We're going to start to go through some of these here. So if you don't hear your question, we've plenty of time, so we'll try to get to them all. So the first question, MorraLee, from our audience is, can you review again when the CSA in a custodial account is reported on the FAFSA or not? So to clarify, this is CSA savings in a bank or credit union, and whether or not that gets reported on the FAFSA.
If it's located in a bank or a credit union and it's in a custodial account, which typically means both the parent and the student name is on the account, it will always be reported on the FAFSA, and very likely the instructions will be to have that reported in the parent section of the FAFSA as a parent asset, since their name is on the account as the custodian.
Okay, great. Thanks for that review, and appreciate everyone sticking through these technical walkthroughs of the financial aid process. I'm definitely learning a lot, so appreciate you clarifying that, MorraLee. Our next question is about a 529 CSA program that uses a 529 account. So the question is, can you confirm if a custodial 529 owned by a CSA program is not an asset of the student or parent, and so neither would report it on the FAFSA? So they're saying a student, the 529 account is owned by the program, and so it's not a student or parent asset. So they're asking, would it get reported on the FAFSA at all, or would it be treated potentially as an outside scholarship or outside funding, but not a parent asset. We'll stick with that part first as a two-part question.
Yeah, I would tell you that, you know, I may have to do a little digging on this. And like I said, I think eventually we'll see some direct guidance from the education department on this as these CSAs come to life. But in most cases, when a 529 account is opened, someone's name is on the account. So the account might be owned by the agency, but it's either in the name of the student or the name of the parent. This would be similar, like sometimes people thought, well, we can get around this if we, you know, if we have the grandparent open the account because the grandparents, you know, information isn't on the FAFSA, and it didn't take long for the directions to correct that. So if it's on behalf of the student, it's going to need to be and the parent's name is in the account, it's going to need to be reported in the parent section of the form. If only the student's name is in the account, then that 529 plan would go in the student section, asset section of the form. So I may need to double check with my financial aid colleagues about that, but I think as long as there is a name associated with the account, the asset is going to have to be reported.
Okay. And how do grandparents' 529 account holdings get processed? Is there a section for grandparents or other relatives?
No, it's not, but it's you know, it's, let me kind of steal the wording here from let's see, yeah, you're going to if it's owned, like here's the way it's received, or it's indicated in the instructions on the FAFSA. Money received or paid on behalf of the student also includes distributions to the student beneficiary from a 529 plan that is owned by someone other than the student or the parents, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, non-custodial parents. You have to include the distribution amounts in the asset question. So it's going to get reported one way or the other, whether it's in a parent name, a grandparent name. They've tightened up that language very clearly to make sure that if it's in the parent and student's names, it's either going to get reported as the whole value of the 529 account, or if it's in someone else's name, the distribution amount is going to get reported on the FAFSA. So the nicest thing I can say is one way or the other, all $529 are going to be reported.
Okay, great. That's helpful. And again, for most of these CSA programs, the program-owned accounts are usually in the hundreds of dollars rather than the tens of thousands as it might be for a high income or parental savings. And then the second part of that question is just a question of impact on the following year's financial aid. So if funds are dispersed directly to the post-secondary institution, would there be any impact to students on the following year's financial aid, or only in the year it's dispersed?
I will say this a little bit about the FAFSA. In some respects, it's a little confusing in that the tax information that you're reporting is always that prior year. But then there are certain questions on the form. For example, cash savings and checking account, the question begins as of the day you're completing the form, right? So it's not a look back, it's not a look forward, it's as of the day that you're doing the form. And then money received on your behalf, which is if that 529 plan was owned by someone else, and if there was a distribution, you know, and that'll be by calendar year. For example, the form that this class is doing right now would be as if there was any distribution received in 2019. Well, if there's a high school senior, the likely answer to that question is no. So it may not catch up with them their freshman year as they begin college. But, you know, in the following year, when there is the distribution made to help pay for fall term expenses, it's then going to turn around and be reported on the FAFSA and it's going to impact the following year.
Got it. Okay. We have a question here about the Q1099 form. So the question is, with regards to withdrawals from a 529 plan and receiving the Q1099 form from the 529 provider, would the withdrawal need to be documented on the FAFSA for the tax year the withdrawal corresponds?
It'll have to be recorded in the calendar year that it was received, that is asked for on the FAFSA. So, I think we're kind of getting into a little bit of technicality here. But for example, if the distribution from the 529 occurs in the year 2020, in the coming year, when the student completes a FAFSA that asks about resources received in 2020, that's when it will be reported. And I'm not sure that answered that person's question exactly. It probably lines up with the tax year as well, except as I said, on the financial aid form, you're reporting prior year information, not always the immediate or current calendar year.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully that answers this person's question. We do have a clarifying question on what I just asked you about the custodial 529 account owned by the program. So Pauline Quint from Maine wanted to clarify in her question that she was talking about an omnibus account, not one opened as an individual entity owned account. And so I think she's asking here is how so in a statewide program like Maine that uses an omnibus 529 account, participants don't own individual accounts, but they're the beneficiary. They all have a little piece of this giant omnibus account, and so it wouldn't be a withdrawal or closing of an individual account. And so she's asking, how would that get reported on the FAFSA? So every child may, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what's going to happen in a situation like that, and I would want to double check with some of my financial aid colleagues, but I'm pretty sure I'm accurate here, is that if it's in an omnibus account, it's not technically getting reported upfront on the FAFSA. When the plan makes a distribution for the student directly to the college, it's going to get counted like an outside scholarship.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So it wouldn't get declared on the FAFSA, but when you're looking at the totality of your financial aid package, it would show up later as an outside scholarship, the same way it would if it was a $500 scholarship from a community foundation.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I think it's going to get caught on the back end versus the front end.
Okay. But it wouldn't be, that's super helpful. So it wouldn't be the student's responsibility necessarily to have to remember and declare on their FAFSA if it's not caught. If a student, let's say they don't remember that they have their My Alphon grant was $500 at birth. Hopefully it's worth a lot more by the time they get to college. It would just be when it gets distributed to their post-secondary institution, it would show up as an outside scholarship and be accounted for then. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. This is so helpful, MorraLee. These are like really in the weeds technical questions, so I appreciate you diving in with us. We get a lot of questions about this throughout the year, so I'm glad we can tackle a lot of them. Our next question is around treatment of CSAs with undocumented students. And let me find it. Okay. If a tax exempt organization is managing the 529 accounts and there is an account assigned for an undocumented student, can the organization withdraw funds and grant them directly to the student to ensure they can still access funds? Our CSA program is a custodial program, but the custodian of the accounts is the city. Would they have to report it in their assets?
Well, in some respects, undocumented students in the majority of cases are not eligible to file a FAFSA. One of the requirements for being eligible to file a FAFSA is having a social security number. And undocumented students in many instances do not have social security numbers. Some students that participate in the DACA program get to the point where they have a SSN assigned, but undocumented students are not eligible for federal financial assistance, and therefore, in most cases, will never be filing the FAFSA. So technically would never be reporting it on a FAFSA.
Okay, and because they're technically not eligible for federal financial aid. And so if some states like California have a state financial aid process.
California, Texas, yep.
Yeah, so this question was from a California program. And so, yeah, Texas as well. So they have their own system for financial aid in which undocumented students are eligible to apply for financial aid solely in that system, correct?
Yes, and it's state aid, so it would depend on, you know, what question exists on the state aid application.
Okay, great. We have another question here. Is it advantageous to spread out distributions from CSAs?
Okay, here comes my two words. It depends. I think for the smaller amounts, I think, for lack of a better word, I think you want to be sort of one and done with the distribution process, if at all possible, for the smaller amounts. You know, if the student has a substantial amount in the savings account, and it would make sense if the organization is willing to do multiple disbursements for the multiple years that a student might be enrolled going after their credential or their degree, you know, that's advantageous to the student. I think we all know that a lot of high school seniors get scholarships, and they're a one-year scholarship. And so sometimes you hear how students have more for the first year and then, you know, don't have as many resources for, you know, their sophomore year and beyond. So, you know, spreading it out can be helpful, but you also have to want to think about the administrative burden related to that. And, you know, so it may depend on setting some policy about distribution levels and amounts and how often, based on perhaps the size of the account that the student has amassed.
Okay, so if you're a program that has maybe a couple hundred students, you could perhaps manage to do more than one distribution. But if you're enrolling thousands of kids every year, you probably don't want to be cutting 10 checks to each participant.
I would think, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would think one and done would be, you know, make sense organizationally for efficiency.
Okay. So we have just a few minutes left. We're going to get through a few more questions. Stepping back a bit, for a program that's just starting out or in development, which type of account, a 529 or a savings account at a bank or credit union, would you recommend in order to help ensure families don't get penalized for these funds? Or is there a big difference because of the limited effect that we expect on financial aid impact?
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, I'm going to say it again. It depends, because I think in general, the families with the low, that, you know, if your program serves a predominant number of families with lower incomes, that assets are not ever going to even be addressed in the financial aid process, then it may not matter which form the program is in. I'm certainly not an expert financial aid advisor or anything like that, but if you take a look at, for example, interest rates on you know, savings accounts in standard financial institutions versus earnings in 529 plans, I think you see dollars grow at a better rate in 529 plans. So that may be more advantageous to the family, you know, to have the dollars that they've invested grow at a better rate. But it is very clear that 529 plans are, you know, if a family does have to report assets, it's very clear that 529s will be reported and counted in the process as the expected family contribution is determined.
Okay, that's a great it depends answer. That's often what we give in response to that question. It depends who your population that you're serving and weighing things like investment growth versus impact on financial aid. So yeah, it depends is a good answer there. So we have a couple of questions that are more generally related to financial aid and not necessarily CSA specific. Oh, wait, one follow-up question. What would be a substantial amount to trigger multi-year distribution? So this was in response to the multiple distribution questions. What's a substantial amount in your mind?
I probably would look at probably a $5,000 benchmark. So under $5,000 might be a single distribution, and over 5,000 may, maybe a multiple distribution.
Okay, great. That's a helpful rule of thumb. So we have a question about financial aid related to rural areas. So in rural areas, a home may be a part of a large parcel of land that is very valuable. Are home/land considered one asset and thus excluded, or is your land counted as an asset on the FAFSA?
I think in general, and I would like to double check with my financial aid friends, but I think in general, it's the home that is excluded. The value of the property is reported, the net
Okay.
value of the property. So, we'll make up numbers here. If you own a property, farm land that is valued at $500,000, but you have a $450,000 mortgage on it, it's the net value. So you might be reporting $50,000 in land value.
Okay, that makes sense. And then one more question here. For family-owned 529 accounts not managed by another organization, so this is just any old family, they have savings in a 529 account.
Right.
What are their distribution options?
Well, those will certainly vary according to the rules set up in that state for that particular 529. I think you see all different kinds of things happening, and a lot of times those are based on families' personal choices. In terms of how much they'll take each year towards the college expenses. Again, sometimes, as I was mentioning earlier, you see students have more resources available to them their freshman year, and there may be a situation, excuse me, where a family doesn't extract any $529 for the freshman year because there was enough other resources, and so they may wait. Some families will do the even distribution, or think about, I'm going to take the value of tuition each year.
Okay, and so for CSA programs, if we're generally speaking about programs where families have balances that are less than $5,000, would you recommend that they do the distribution in their first year as a program? Would you say, let's get this money out the door while these students are freshmen, or would you recommend that they have kind of a staggered approach or that even year distribution?
I think I would get it out the door the freshman year. When you take a look at, College Board does an annual report every year of trends in financial aid, and you see roughly the average unmet need of a student at most, for example, four-year institutions is over $6,000 a year. So if you have a distribution that's $5,000 or under, a student in a single year, particularly if enrolled at a four-year campus, is very likely to need all of those dollars to cover the expenses.
Thanks, MorraLee. That's really helpful context. I was going to ask you earlier what the average unmet need is. So it seems unlikely, at least with the current cost of institutions, post-secondary institutions, and families trying to cobble together a combination of financial aid and scholarships and outside scholarships and CSA savings, that it seems unlikely that families are going to have a lot of money sitting in a CSA account that would be available for future years. And most likely they're going to need every penny each semester as it's available.
Right.
Great. Well, we are just about at time, so we've Thank you everyone for submitting questions. I'm going to turn it over to Oliver to wrap us up, but I just want to personally say thank you, MorraLee. I learned a lot during this, and I'm glad that you were willing to get into the nitty-gritty of some of these technical questions with us. So Oliver, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Erin. Yes, so thank you to MorraLee and NCAN. We really appreciate you being on here to kind of break all of that down for us. And also thank you again to the audience. We appreciate your comments, your questions, and we just really appreciate your engagement overall in this webinar today. So again, if you have any questions, any thoughts that you didn't get out during the webinar, you can reach out to us at our email, which is savingsforkids@prosperitynow.org. And again, thank you all for coming today. We wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, and we, just hope your families remain safe and healthy. Please complete our survey at the close of this webinar. And again, this webinar will be recorded and available to be shared. Thank you, everybody, and have a great Thanksgiving.